Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features Dr. Adrienne L. Childs, an independent scholar, art historian, and curator. She is Senior Consulting Curator at the Phillips Collection. Her current book is an exploration of Black figures and European Decorative Arts entitled Ornamental Blackness, the Black Figure and European Decorative Arts, published by Yale University Press. She is currently co-curator of Vivian Browne, My Kind of Protest for the Phillips Collection, opening June 28th through September 28th of 2025. She recently co-curated The Color of Anxiety, Race, Sexuality and Disorder in Victorian Sculpture at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds, England. She was a guest curator of Riffs and Relations, African American Artists and the European Modernist Tradition at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. in 2020. In April of 2022, the High Museum of Art awarded Adrienne the 2022 Driskell Prize in recognition of her contribution to African American art and art history. Adrienne is co-editor of the volume essays Blacks and Blackness, and European Art of the Long 19th Century, Routledge. She also contributed an essay on art and activism to Volume 5, Part 2 of The Image of the Black in Western Art, edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and David Bindman. As former curator at the David C. Driskell Center at the University of Maryland, she curated many exhibitions, including Her Story, lithographs by Marco Humphrey, Arabesque, The Art of Stephanie Polk, Creative Spirit, The Art of David C. Driskell, and Tradition Redefined, the Larry and Brenda Thompson Collection of African American Art. Adrienne holds a BA from Georgetown University, an MBA from Howard University, and a PhD in the History of Art from the University of Maryland. Enjoy this episode featuring art historian Dr. Adrienne L. Childs, and please visit cerebralwomen.com for her expanded bio. Welcome, Adrienne. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, Phyllis, I'm so happy to be here talking with you this afternoon.
My first question is, when in your life did you recognize your interest in the visual arts?
That's a great question because it was really stemming from my childhood, because I grew up with a mother who was an artist. And actually, her father was an artist as well. But I grew up in a home where art was a part of our everyday life, not just her work as an artist, a practicing artist, as a painter, and she did collage and a lot of mixed media. But she made her own clothes. She did jewelry. She made creative food. She collected. So it's kind of an artsy growing up. But unfortunately, I was not a talented artist. So I was kind of frustrated because I wasn't as a natural like she was. So, but I always knew that I was interested in creativity and I wanted to see my life unfold in that way.
When did you decide you want to be an art historian?
Because of the fact that I was a frustrated artist, when I discovered the fact that there was such thing as art history, which was when I was in high school, really, I realized that was what the direction I want to go to. And it was interesting because I went on a trip to France with a group of teenagers. And of course, we went to the Louvre on a tour. And as soon as I walked into the room where they were hanging those grand manner 19th century European paintings by Delacroix and Géricault, really gigantic, romantic, dynamic paintings, I didn't know what they were about. I thought they were beautiful. And I was just said to myself, this is the kind of thing I was interested in. I was always interested in history. And I loved the way these paintings told what I thought was real history, but in a different kind of way. I liked being in the museum, even though it was kind of a rarefied atmosphere, and it felt kind of exclusionary almost, but I felt like this is someplace that I would like to work. So it was a dream of mine. And I started just going to museums more often. But when I went to college, I studied art history as a freshman. And I knew that I wanted to study art history. My family thought, what in the world are you doing? You're never going to get a job in that. But I was always good at it. It was interesting to me. I liked my professors. And I just felt like it was home.
How did you enter the curatorial field?
I went to a couple of different colleges, but I graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, I had some internships. I was very lucky to have an internship at the Hirshhorn Museum. And I worked with the curators there. I was in the curatorial department. And there you have it. I said, okay, well, this is what I would really love to do. But I recognized that most of the curators at the Smithsonian had PhDs. And so that was the kind of goal that I had. Well, I'm going to try to get a PhD. And I'm looking at it in steps, right? And then I thought, well, maybe I'm sure that the Smithsonian was going to hire me. So that didn't happen. But the curators who I worked with were very encouraging. And when I told my family that I wanted to go and get a PhD, they discouraged it to the point where they said, well, no, you have to be more practical. And so I actually went to Howard University and studied business. I got a business degree at Howard, an MBA. And I was just kind of biding my time, thinking to myself, okay, well, I'll get this MBA while I try to figure out how I want to really do what I want to do. And it wasn't until many years later, after I got married, had a family, and we moved back to the DC area, that I told my husband this is my lifelong dream, is to be a curator. So I want to start on the journey to get a PhD, not knowing how I would become a curator. But I was lucky to have a friend of my family named David Driskell, who was a major art historian, artist, collector, stellar in the field of African-American art history, as my mentor. So that helped quite a bit. And while I was in school getting this degree, I worked with David Driskell on exhibitions of his collection. I curated his own art, and I got a lot of really great experience while in school getting a PhD in 19th century European art. My practical work was in 20th century African-American art. So I was getting kind of both sides of the kind of coin that I'm still dealing with this today. So I was lucky to be able to get curatorial projects while I'm in graduate school. And when I'm in graduate school, I still have 2 little kids. So I went back as what I call a seasoned student.
What do you enjoy most about your curatorial role?
Well, I'll say that once I graduated, I was lucky enough again to be hired at the David Driskell Center at the University of Maryland. Was a center named after him that was focused on African-American art, documenting, exhibiting, etc. So what I really enjoyed was being part of exhibitions and publications that brought to light artists that were out of the mainstream, if you will. Many of these African-American artists that we knew about because we studied African-American art, certainly David Driskell's one of the founders of the field. But you realize that many of them didn't even have a book written on them. They had very little representation in museums. So we were really trailblazing and giving exhibitions to artists who later are part of the sort of canonical artists in the field. I really enjoyed that. And as I continued in my career, as I continue to develop projects out of my own interests, that's what I really like now. I like to come up with a concept and figuring out what combinations of artists or which artists would be interesting and enlightening to introduce audiences to, who needs to be highlighted. and how to make a contribution to the field, but just coming up with the concept. And I always come up with these concepts that are very conceptual, if you will, a concept that's conceptual. That makes sense. Like my show, Riffs and Relations, I really enjoyed that. And that was about Black artists in the European Modernist Tradition. So it kind of combined my experience in European art with my experience in African American art. And I was kind of interested in, back in the late 80s, 90s, artists who were riffing on the canon, if you will, who were looking at European art and critiquing it in a way or engaging with it. Black artists who were doing that. And so the Phillips Collection was kind enough to accept my project. And we developed a really interesting exhibition based on this concept where we showed both the European art and the African American art. These concepts were things that scholars had written about, but you often didn't see them together in the rooms together in museums like you might see them now. So I enjoy those, thinking of a concept and bringing it into fruition.
And on the topic of artists who many of us aren't aware of, let's talk about the Phillips Collection, your work regarding Vivian Browne.
Oh, thank you for asking. I was asked to join a young curator named Amara Antilla, who was working with the Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, who were conceiving of planning an exhibition on the artist Vivian Browne, who I knew about a little bit. There was not much information out there on her. But when I was asked to join this project, Vivian Browne's family and her estate had provided access to a treasure trove of information about this Black woman artist who was working during the 60s, 70s, and into and 80s in New York. She was very much an activist. She was out there protesting with Faith Ringgold and Benny Andrews at the Whitney. She was protesting at the Met. She was a feminist. She joined the feminist artist collective called Soho 20, which is a mixed race, a feminist group. She was in this Black collective named Where We At, which is getting more attention right now. So she's really part of this movement. But what's interesting is we didn't know much about her work. Her work was not really part of the canonical stories that was being told in some of the textbooks, if you will. So it was an opportunity to really bring focus on an artist who had been kind of lost over the decades. And all the materials were available to us because they kept great records, the family did. And Camille Billups, her friend, and who was a major figure in the field as well. So I joined Amara Antilla, and we've been working on this for several years. And the show now is called Vivian Browne, My Kind of Protest. And it already opened in Cincinnati at the Contemporary Art Center, and it's getting ready to open in Washington, D.C. at the Phillips Collection. And this is the kind of thing the Phillips Collection loves to do, because from the very beginning, the institution, Duncan Phillips, was collecting American artists who people didn't know about, and gave some of the most, what we now think of some of the most important American modernists like Milton Avery, their first show. He also gave Sam Gilliam, the brilliant Black abstract artist from DC, his first museum show. So we're not afraid to bring somebody in who is lesser known, but who deserves to be a part of the conversation. So her work is abstract often. She did go to Africa, but her works in response to her trip to Africa were really interesting, bright colors, very abstract. She did a lot of landscapes as well. She was interested in the environment. I guess the most assertively protest-like series she did was called the Little Men series in the 60s, where she was painting a series of paintings of white men behaving badly, screaming, yelling, spoiled, overblown. And it's interesting how these screaming and stomping and storming white men kind of resonate now in Washington, D.C. But she was painting them in the 60s. But she was working in the Department of Education, and she was just kind of reflecting on the sort of bureaucracy and the patriarchy. It was a very feminist kind of thing. But it was interesting to see a Black woman who painted a whole series on white men. And that also might be one of the reasons why we didn't really hear about it or see about it. But now I think it's very powerful and really interesting that she had the guts to do that at that time. So she's a really gutsy artist, and I'm really excited about introducing her to new audiences.
So there's another project you worked on that I found fascinating. So let's talk about your current book, Ornamental Blackness, the Black Figure in European Decorative Arts.
Oh, yes. What is it? Labor of love. As I said before, I've been working in between these two big fields, African American art or art by African Americans, and the representation of Black figures in European art. Often they come together, like that project Riffs and Relations. But when I was first working on my dissertation, and that was quite a while ago, 20 years, it was on exotic figures in European art. And one of the things you do when you're writing a dissertation like this is often look at other objects in popular culture that might shore up your argument about whatever it is your topic is. So mine was Orientalist painting. And a lot of the objects that were floating around at that time were decorative objects that featured exotic Black figures that were, that correlated to these paintings and sculptures I was writing about. And then when I went to do the research on it, I realized there's really nothing written on this. And so when you finally finish your dissertation, it's like, oh God, just get me out. And then you think, well, what material in this project that you spent so much time on, where is the opening? Or what would be the most interesting thing to follow through? And the fact that there was so little, almost nothing really written on this figure of the Black body in European decorative arts that really goes back centuries. I felt like that was the road less taken and really interesting, and I would kind of pave the way in this. And so I've been working on it since 2010 when I received a fellowship at it was then called the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. It's now the Hutchins Center. And they supported my research and they supported this project from the beginning. And that's when I started. And I've been working on it ever since, on and off, clearly, because I've done many other projects. But what it does is it starts in the court of Louis XIV. My book does, and just looks at luxury objects created in largely in courts, in courtly circumstances, because these are one-of-a-kind objects, silver, ebony, jeweled, and how these Black figures who are often in servitude and posed and laboring bodies also are luxury objects, rarefied objects that bring a sense of quote unquote splendor into these areas and into these spaces that are basically fueled in many ways by the actual labor of Black people in the colonies. We're talking about the colonial era. So what's the relationship between Black labor and luxury in Europe during those times? And you see these objects sort of tell that story in ways that is often hard to see because they're so beautiful many times. And people along the way have not given them the sort of political grounding that they need. So my work has done that. And it has been foundational in some ways. I hate to toot my own horn, but it's sort of opened up a discussion on this that is growing and growing as we speak, from silver to porcelain to furniture to jewelry. I didn't get to jewelry in the book, so that's the next book. How do these luxury objects speak to bigger issues of race and representation and power?
What do you feel is the purpose of art?
Oh, that is a very great question. It's a big question. And that's something I said to myself when I came into the Louvre that day. What is the purpose of this? And as a historian, I loved learning the different contexts and the different eras, from ancient art that had spiritual purposes or mythical purposes of demonstrating power. I mean, if we're talking about Western art right now, we would say European art and American art, but was often an arm of the power structures, whether they're the courts or religious organizations use art for communications, use art to establish certain ways of thinking and ways of seeing life. And it was very much handed down from on high. If you're talking about these kind of major paintings and sculptures and things like that, were really an arm of tool for learning, a tool for communicating the ideology of those in power. And then it starts to change when it becomes lesser and lesser about those power dynamics and more about individual ideas, about the individual artists and their the way they see the world and their interpretation. When art becomes less of an arm of the state as opposed to an arm of or manifestation of personal concepts, or even art as a resistance against these power dynamics. So in our era, art is very much a personal reflection. And it also is a creative way of being able to communicate ideas that sometimes we try to communicate in writing, or sometimes we try to communicate with political agendas, but it's much more easily consumed through artistry. So I feel like art has so many different roles. Like the decorative arts that I do, those are sort of applied arts, material cultures. And those might be objects made in multiples. There are designs that maybe someone comes up with that reflect the society's values, but they're not attributed to one artist. They're almost like manufactured. But there's something about those manufactured objects that are done in multiples, that are sold on the streets, let's say, even anything like that are consumed in those ways that reflect the consumption is something that reflects how the society, what they are interested in, what they accept, you see. In other words, they're less of an individual statement, but more of sort of a collective statement. That's why sort of this ornamental blackness talks about these objects being the notion of black servitude is something that was accepted widely and not even challenged, because you could have a teacup with it on it and it becomes an everyday object. So there's one sort of role of art. And then, like I said, the other is very much individualistic, and it's become more and more individualistic as we move forward, even though sometimes those individuals who are creating art are part of groups, part of ideological circles of artists, let's say Black arts movement artists who have an agenda, and art is used to further their political agenda. Art is used in that way to define identity. I mean, that's one thing is for African American artists from the Harlem Renaissance forward, is it was a way to define ourselves in contradistinction to how we were defined by others. So in contradistinction to the rabid and ugly stereotypes, art comes in, creatives come in to say, no, this is how we are able to define ourselves. So it becomes very much about place making, space making. How do we see ourselves, and how do we write our own histories, as opposed to our histories being written about us? So then art becomes a tool for establishing a cultural consciousness. If it's left to someone else outside of the culture, or who has a vested interest in destroying that culture, then it becomes something disingenuous and violent. So art can be something that's healing, and it's something that is representative of a way of thinking of yourself and your quote unquote people. But everyone is different. You don't want to make it too broad strokes, but certainly for African American artists in the 20th century, as we've come through the 20th century, it was very much a political tool for establishing Black identity and Black culture.
How do you feel the Black Lives Matters movement is impacting the mission of art institutions?
Well, I think that there was a sort of a wake-up call, a reckoning that kind of swept through major art institutions. It was a long time coming. It was slowly building. And then with some of the major events like George Floyd's murder, and the pandemic, truly, it became something that felt urgent. But I think some art institutions had a knee-jerk reaction, and others had been moving along toward those lines of diversity, if you will, already. And it kind of was an impetus to keep pushing. But the knee-jerk reactions were those that were pulled back as soon as this movement started being questioned, and is certainly being pulled back now as even our administration is pulling back on notions of diversity and race as a legitimate topic. But I do feel like it really shook it up. in some really good ways. And I think that it's permanently changed. With some of the museums have permanently changed. Look how many exhibitions about, if we're talking about African American art, Black diaspora art, that the Met has had in the last 10 years compared to the 10 before. That's just one highly visible organization.
What's the role of the museum trustee in terms of guiding these museums to continue supporting work about Black culture?
I think it depends on the museum and how powerful the trustees are. Trustees are often collectors, so trustees can purchase important works and donate it, and that is very important. And obviously they can be donors. They're donors to the museum, and they can push toward certain kinds of exhibitions and collecting practices. Exhibitions are one thing, collecting is something else. So when a work by a Black artist, for instance, is in a major museum, it validates them in ways when it comes to the gaze of other institutions, scholars, and things like that. Maybe it's not right, maybe it's a flawed system, but it's the truth. So having an exhibition about an artist, or including certain art and certain kinds of exhibitions, historical or contemporary, is one thing. Having it in the collection is another thing. And I think those are important. That's an important way to validate these artists. And it was a long time before Black artists were really being collected. And trustees had a lot, I feel, in some of these major museums, trustees can have a lot to do with that. And they can also push in the other direction. It just depends on the museum and the trustee. But I do feel like they do have a role in collecting and in supporting exhibitions and supporting curatorial lines. Let's say you want a curator dedicated to certain kinds of art, or who is at least versed in it. So that's another thing the trustees can do, is to push for a staff that has the expertise to widen the breadth of the kinds of exhibitions and collecting that goes on in institutions. But you have to note, every institution isn't obligated to collect everything. You just can't.
Do you feel Black art can be defined?
No. And this is an age-old question I'm sure that many of your speakers have talked about, and it was being debated with artists. I'll go back to the 60s, but further back than that. When I was teaching, my class, instead of being called African American art, as if art itself was raced, was art by African Americans. And that is, for me, Black art, if you will, is art by Black people. And that's all you can say in terms of the connections. Obviously, you can go through and see a lot of connections, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. So you can't eliminate those who are working in ceramics or painting trees like Vivian Browne, or doing abstractions. You can't eliminate them because their work does not use the Black figure or talk about quote unquote Black stories. It's just not fair. So I define it by art by Black people. And there is still a story to be told there because of the collective kind of experiences that Black people have had in America. We're talking about in the United States, not over the world, but our experiences have been circumscribed by this racist society and institutional and systemic issues that have funneled Black artists in certain directions, into certain schools, not in certain schools, in institutions not in this institution, but in that institution, and that has shaped it. But that's as far as I will go, because I want to make sure that our abstractionists are accounted for.
Was there a particular artist or painting that really influenced you early on?
Like I said, when I was younger, I was really interested in European art of the 19th century after going to the Louvre. So I was interested in the Romantics, Delacroix. I was interested in the Impressionists. And these are the kinds of art that was readily available in books that you saw, right? And this is the kind of art that was taught in your intro to Western art as a freshman. And I was also interested, when I finally got introduced to African American art as a subject, became completely interested in that. But in terms of specific artists I love, just because I love them, I've always loved Matisse. And, it's interesting. I as a young African-American woman in school, I was always afraid to say that I wanted to work on a white artist because I felt like maybe I didn't have that access, which is absolutely not true. I don't know how it got in my head like that, but that's the way it gets in your head. And also there's a pressure on the side of even the Black community. If you have the voice to talk about something like art, then you need to use it to talk about your people. But I always loved Matisse. And later on, when I started working with David Driskell, he became really an inspiration to me because not only did I work closely with him and I loved his art, which was very Matisse-like, he was also someone like my mother, who died when she was 44. He was someone who lived the 360 degrees of art. And I was close enough to him and his family to see it. And that was really influential to me as an artist. He's a collector, he's a gardener, he's a stylish person. He loved to cook and all the ways that to make art a part of your life. And that's what I've really tried to do. So I can do most of it. Still not a good artist, but I can cook. But I like the 360 degree artist because I feel like there's something very authentic about living that life.
What are the greatest challenges you see artists facing today?
I think artists are faced with a really challenging art market. I think that galleries that have gained a lot of power and a broad reach and a lot of control over the market have been great for many artists, but many more are outside of that system. I feel like the explosion of interest, if we're talking about African American or Black artists in the United States, the explosion of interest has been great, but it is experiencing somewhat of a deflation. And a lot of that is due to the way the market works, because that's a natural characterization of a market. You remember, I went to business school. So it's going to happen. When you're tied up in it in that way, it becomes sort of a roller coaster. And then how do you enter onto that roller coaster? How do you jump on and where do you go if you're dependent on that? Because now, let me just say this, let me back up and say that museums are more and more dependent on galleries, work together more closely with galleries. And so even though people think of museums as wholly independent, we have to work together with galleries who are not only involved with contemporary artists, but they're representing artists' estates that you might want to work with. And for the most part, they want the same thing you do, but there is a commercial enterprise. Again, there's a certain market that museums typically not necessarily been beholden to, but that we now have to think about. So the art market and art fairs, gallery structures, and collectors are very important in this world. And maybe it's always been that way. But I think in the recent years for Black artists to be in demand and sort of subject to the whims and the whimsy of this kind of market is a real challenge. And there's also education. A lot of times, people are just like your grandmother says, go to school, get your education. So how does an artist come through who decides not to get, a master's in fine art? How about those who are not going to Yale to get the master's in fine art? And there are certain schools that have been very successful in funneling students into careers. So these are challenges, I think, but there's always a challenge in becoming an artist.
I've enjoyed our episode very much, and this is going to be our final question. As an art historian, how do you want the work you do impact the art world?
That's a great question. I would like to have made a contribution to my field. I often write about things that I want to know about, and I haven't seen anyone else do that. I haven't seen it written anywhere or put in that way. So I want to just be a part of the conversation that I thought when I was young was so fascinating. I would like my writing and the exhibitions and even the videos and podcasts to be not only interesting, but helpful to the next generations. One of the things that David Driskell taught me was replenishing the field, nourishing the field, and paying it forward So I want to pay it forward like he did to me, and I'm really grateful for that. And I want younger scholars, younger artists, younger friends, and people interested in the art world to be encouraged to participate and know they can, because someone like me was able to come in and do it as well.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for the work you do. I'm so glad that you have the interest that you have so you could share these stories with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.